Hello, thanks for joining us with Compassionate Schools Trauma-Informed Care in Action, Episode 4, Wendy. Can you believe it?
I actually can't believe that we're already recording episode 4, but I'm really excited about this one.
It's the one with predictability.
That's right. Can we see into the future?
We are joining you from the District Mental Health Team, and I'm Linda Hughes, a counselor.
And I'm Wendy Belfield, a social worker. We put our pictures here since we're having to do this via podcast. We at least wanted you to be able to see who was saying what when.
So our objectives today include talking about trauma-sensitive practices in the context of compassionate schools, also deepening our understanding of how trauma-informed care and cultural competence and intersectionality, how they dovetail. And we will walk through an example to see how it looks in action with prevention, intervention, and restoration.
All right, so we're getting started right off the bat by revisiting predictability as one of the tenets of trauma-informed care. And when we think about predictability, we kind of frame it similarly to how we frame transparency as a means of building trust. And trust is maybe one of the most important characteristics of a solid, healthy relationship, right? So building trust involves many things, not the least of which is transparency and predictability. So believing that a person is like earnestly providing you with necessary and relevant information. So it's not really about all of the information, like somebody being able to tell you everything or provide you with all the predictability, that is possible. It's really with the necessary and relevant information, and you being able to reliably anticipate or predict an outcome of an event or a behavior. So these are this predictability and transparency. They're foundational characteristics of trust. And without trust, our relationships are vulnerable. We have a harder time convincing people that it's safe to remove that armor that we've been talking about in other episodes, and we're going to revisit again.
Yeah, because if you think about an unpredictable environment, walking into that, then you don't want to take healthy educational risk, interpersonal chances of opening up or asking questions even.
Yeah.
Because you're not sure what to expect.
Yeah, I think about like anytime you walk into a situation that's unfamiliar to you or that hasn't been sort of staged or given you some ability to prepare, you kind of walk in with your shields up, with that armor up, just to feel it out. Even if nothing else, you might not be in a combative pose, but you're definitely going to kind of protect yourself a little bit and make sure that you understand the situation before you take risks, like you said. Yeah, makes sense. So we wanted to take a minute to revisit the concepts of cultural competency and intersectionality that we have been weaving through all of the presentations so far. These concepts are going to continue to feature significantly in the work because they're such an important component of creating the safe and engaging learning environments that we're really striving for with compassionate schools. So we want to make sure that we're always making an effort to maintain this conscious awareness of these concepts until eventually, hopefully, they just become like an unconscious part of our practices, right, Linda?
Yeah.
So one of the very first steps to becoming a culturally competent educator is to raise our awareness of our own cultural connections and how those connections shape the way we view the world and the people around us. And the goal here is really to begin to peel back the layers of identities and connections that make us all human, and to really acknowledge that those cultural identities and connections influence the way we see, experience, and understand the world around us. And that's really going to feature significantly in today's session as we talk about our example.
Yeah, it's really such an honor to be able to take care and educate children who come from all different kinds of families, who have various cultural perspectives, value systems, racial and gender identities, and social and economic resources. Children that have different health concerns, strengths and gifts, and disabilities. And so there are so many aspects when we talk about intersectionality to one person's identity. And some parts of us might give us privilege, which can feel like hitting the accelerator when we're trying to do something. And other aspects of who we are and where we come from can feel like there are brakes on when we're trying to move forward. And if we look at somebody else and we respond as though the one part of their identity is all of them, we can miss a lot and not only be less effective, but potentially hurtful to them without even knowing, even though we have the best of intentions. And so this is why this stuff is so important. Opening ourselves to learn about the big and the little pitfalls on the way to being culturally competent and trauma informed.
Makes sense. All right, so here we are continuing to revisit this slide as we're going to do through all of our episodes. This came from an interview that I heard between Alicia Keys and Brene Brown. This was about her book, More Myself. And during the interview, she was asked about this particular quote that's on the slide. She said, "We shift ourselves not in sweeping pivots, but in movements so tiny that they're hardly perceptible." And her explanation about what that meant really just stuck with me. What she was saying here is in her experience as a child at school, when she was trying to fit in and be liked and accepted, she realized after years and sort of reflecting back that she didn't have a sense of self beyond the messages that she was receiving from the people around her. And because the adjustments that she made to herself, like her clothes, her speech, her hair, were just a series of little tiny movements towards a cultural norm that she unconsciously thought made her like everyone else or made her normal, those adjustments happened so subtly and so subconsciously that not only did she fail to recognize it, but neither did like her staff or her teachers around her. They didn't see it either. So in our mind, as the reason why, this becomes important to us beyond the obvious parallels to our own students, this idea of tiny movements also has relevance to how we as educators can make our own tiny movements. So what we mean by that is, what if we can say to ourselves that we don't have to expect ourselves to make sweeping pivots towards cultural competence, right?
That sounds overwhelming.
It's very overwhelming. I don't even know if it's possible, to do it. But so what if rather than that sort of sweeping, pivot, can we make our own tiny movements, starting with inclusive behaviors and ideas, being mindful about the subtle messages that we're sending to the students in our schools? That's one tiny movement we can make towards being culturally competent. So in this episode, because we've been talking about this through all the episodes, right?
Yeah, we talked about inclusive images.
Yeah, like the visuals.
Materials, examples, using people's name.
Yeah.
Specific, even if it's unusual, learning the student's name and using it.
Yeah. Which can be difficult when students have names that aren't familiar to us, are unique in some way. We talked about inclusive visuals, inclusive language, thinking about like the broadness of what a family looks like, and considering those kinds of things. So today in this session, we're really talking about the communities, and knowing the communities that we serve. So many of us, I know me for one, I'm an example of this, we work in communities that we don't live in. And when those communities are maybe Title I, like those of us who work in Title I schools, so maybe it's an impoverished community or an underprivileged community or an under-resourced community, we might start thinking that our goal is to provide our students with an education to sort of lift them out of those communities, right? And that goal might actually align with the goals of the student and even the family. But it's important not to oversimplify our view of that community or neighborhood as just something that the student has to overcome or escape. It's important to look for strengths in the community and resilience within the community. If we get to know the neighborhoods and communities where our students live, then we can start to see some of those strengths, and we can start to like try to understand and convey respect for the diverse cultural values and beliefs that might be attached to that community, and consider how those values and beliefs might offer opportunities to actually positively impact the students or influence the students. So one example might be like, are there any faith-based organizations like a church or something that serve that community? Or maybe there's a rec center that the kids all go to, after school or in the evening. So looking for places where the students or families congregate, looking for the people and organizations that are trying to serve those communities, and really developing or trying to develop or reach out for relationships within that community that could really help to demonstrate we understand this community, we respect and we value the people in this community, and we see the potential for there to be a positive influence on our students.
I can just see from the perspective of a student as well, as they grow, even if they do end up leaving the community, to feel like their community was embraced by the school.
Yeah.
Makes them perhaps be able to integrate their own history.
Yeah.
And not feel like, well, that was that time in my life and I had to leave to become good and real and important.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's more of a progression.
Yeah.
And an acceptance of them as a whole person.
Right. Right. Exactly. And it's hard. It's hard to do this because sometimes we look around the communities and it's hard to see the strengths. It's hard to see the resilience. It's hard to look past sort of the negative aspects that we see. So this is a challenge for sure, but it's a challenge worth taking.
So there are a few steps to learning and to growth. The first step is to understand something intellectually. We can learn about something and understand and agree with it. And then the next step is to put it into practice under ideal conditions. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, I see I can do that thing. I put that into action. But then it's another level to be tested in the storm and still be able to use best practices.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it doesn't always happen that way. Like we don't always get to test our skills in the most ideal situation.
Yeah, true.
But if we think it through, and think through, okay, I can do this and this and this, and start thinking through what might that chaotic situation look like. That's how we can embed some predictability, even with our own skills, if we can anticipate some of the chaos that might come our way. But you're right, that's the challenge. We sort of learn things in this professional development environment that's very controlled and very benign, and then we are challenged to use those skills under really stressful situations.
Yeah, and that we could be gentle with ourselves in the process and realize, okay, this is a process.
Yeah,
I'm not expected to jump just because I agree with something to immediate competence with it.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, good point. So kind of revisiting the tiny movement conversation that we were having to become culturally competent and create these safe, empowering, and equitable communities for our schools. We continue to kind of be drawn back to Brene Brown here. So this is a slide that shows up in all of our episodes.
Brene Brown.
Yeah, because we're fans. We fangirl her all the time. So you might remember us then talking about this sort of call to action that Brene provides to educators. And she's done so much research on trauma, shame, and vulnerability that I feel like this carries so much more weight than just an idea. It's backed up by a lot of research. So here she's just reminding us about the importance of creating psychologically safe spaces for our students. Because what she's saying here is that we talked about that armor, that students are coming to school and being crushed by the weight of their armor. And if they're not able to take that armor off, and sort of hang it on a rack, then they're not going to be fully present to receive that high quality instruction or experience the kind of academic achievement that we really want for our students. So for us, I think ongoing through all of our sessions and what we're always trying to kind of answer is how do we do that? How do we do that for ourselves and how do we do that for our students? How do we create an environment that allows them to feel comfortable taking off that armor? And this cultural competency piece, this like little movement towards seeing the whole child for all of the aspects of who they are, right? All the
Yeah.
intersections of their humanness. That's our that's our ultimate goal, is to take little tiny movements towards broadening our view of these students and of ourselves and of the other people around us, so that we all feel comfortable and safe taking off our armor for those moments in time.
Yeah, the trauma informed care tenets, that underlying safety, not just
Yeah.
physical safety, but that emotional, psychological
Yeah.
safety, it really has to be there. And, safety, transparency, predictability,
Hmm.
voice, and choice. I love like kind of looking at it through the lens of those tenets
Yeah.
and saying, how do we create this? If we don't have emotional safety,
Yeah.
then how do you take off your armor if
Right.
something doesn't feel like I can take risk and I'm going to be, things are predictable. I
Right.
understand what's going on.
Yeah, well, that's the
Yeah.
vulnerability piece, right? Like
Yes.
that's the if in order to take risks, you have to expose yourself to vulnerability.
Hmm.
And in order to expose yourself to vulnerability, you have to overcome a lot of experiences that you may have had
Yeah.
up till now, and also sort of the anticipation of the bad things that might happen, if you take this risk.
Especially with kids coming with a trauma background, whether
Hmm.
you know it or not, the predictability, okay, this person is not just safe for 3 weeks, they continue to be safe, and now I can start to take off my armor.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly.
So let's think through a real life example, and picture this. A child has recently joined your class, and displays high energy, high impulsivity, and is motivated by making peers laugh. It sounds like fun, right? When you redirect this student, there are jokes about your authority. So, in that kind of situation, how skilled do you feel in steering that behavior management of your class when the student keeps throwing a wrench into your instruction and your thought process and all those kind of structures you've created to create that environment? How does your emotional response change? And I don't know what kind of student you may have visualized as I was talking that through, if it's one you know or just an anonymous student coming in. If there is, how does your emotional response change if the student is of a different ethnic background than you? So, if the student is different than you, does that require like additional awareness or a thought process where you sort of think through something to check yourself or to see where you are? What does that look like for you? When we notice one aspect of identity, whether it's the color of a person's skin, their gender, their sexuality, their skill with the English language, maybe a physical disability, their intellectual, even impersonal, interpersonal, or academic abilities. It's really our brain's nature to want to understand more, to kind of figure something out and to fill in some blanks even immediately. So we're neurologically built to respond emotionally to just little pieces of information. And we aren't aware of what our unconscious assumptions are. If we aren't aware, then we can interpret things differently, in maybe in a way that doesn't even match with our conscious value system.
Right. So this makes a lot of sense to me, just in thinking about how it's almost necessary for our brains to have unconscious functioning all the time, like running in the background,
Yeah.
because we live in a super complex world, right? And if we were constantly having to rely on our conscious streams of thought to interpret and function and move and make decisions,
Too much.
it's too much. So we're neurologically designed for our brain to respond unconsciously to some of the things that are happening around us in order to function at all in our environment.
Yeah, so we see a couple of pieces of information and we sort of fill out sort of a general idea of what it is the person is coming at it, or the situation, whatever it is that's kind of in our environment.
Yeah.
We want to understand it. We want to simplify it. We want to kind of figure out the risk of what's happening, or figure out maybe our potential involvement in it.
Yeah, for problem solving, for anything, you know, it's
survival skill.
It is a survival skill. Yeah, absolutely. So in thinking about this this actual example of this student that you described, how do we get that particular student to take off their armor, right? So in this example, you might not even recognize the behavior as armor, right? We might see it or immediately categorize it as just disrespect or misbehavior or whatever. But if we're to assume that it's armor of some kind, you know, then that might help keep us in that place of problem solving and trying to figure things out. So this idea of prevention, intervention, and restoration, this helps us keep sort of that fresh mindset and expanded view of ourselves and of the student, so that we can increase our opportunities to connect with those challenging students as ongoing prevention. So when we're identifying that this is something that keeps happening, right? It's pretty predictable at this point. It keeps happening. Part of the prevention includes connection. We can improve our chances of success with the intervention if we're viewing it with curiosity and continuing to try and understand it. And then we can fortify those relationships with our students and our families, and even the colleagues around us who may be also trying to problem solve or support through restoration. So we can kind of assume or predict that we're not always going to have success in our interventions for a variety of reasons. So something might go wrong along the way. And then it's always important to come back and look at how might we restore or repair a relationship that's been damaged as a result of whatever it is that we're doing.
There are lots of things that we don't have control over, right? Yeah. So it's about kind of problem solving through that. I love that overview, Wendy.
Thank you.
So regardless of our own background, if this student is of a minority or a marginalized group, the efforts we make to connect and validate and build that rapport can be extra powerful. Prevention is about what you already have in place, like the structures and culture that you create in your classroom. You might use PBIS. There's lots of tools available in the PBIS literature and things that we have available, resources that we have available to us. We have the TIC tenets, safety, transparency, predictability, voice, and choice. You can look at it through that lens and say, how is my classroom with this, and kind of make some changes to increase those things. We have the SEL and coaching. So students who are struggling, and you do this tier 1, 2 to whole class, like let them know that you see that who they are and their good intention. Creating that warm and welcoming atmosphere in your classroom that is infused with the tenets of TIC is powerful. And then it helps students to actually grow into their potential. You fostered a culture where good intentions are implied, like the way you're looking at the students and responding to them, where everyone is seen as sometimes needing different kinds of support. And that feels normal, putting up air quotes, Wendy.
I see them.
And that it's safe there to be real, to stumble on things, and to get support.
Yeah, I see this this whole like slide with prevention and all of these sort of tools, and I know that a lot of our staff, our teachers and other staff are are doing these things or
Yes,
working towards these things or
absolutely.
aware of these things. I think for me, when we continue to just reinforce it, it's about always sort of broadening that view of things and
Hmm.
expanding that view. So we might get overly focused at times on like one aspect of this, like let's get our PBIS framework in place and
Yeah.
let's tick those boxes. And that's fine, that's great. But just continuing to use those tools as a way to really get to know ourselves and get to know our students, and that those relationships and that coaching piece where we're like,
Yeah.
oh, I see what's happening here, and I'm not going to put that behavior in a box and categorize it as something. I'm going to say, I'm going to peel that back a little bit and say, I wonder what else might be going on. And I'm
Yeah.
going to keep saying this, like this whole idea of like staying curious. If we don't stay curious, we sort of drop into a place of judgment, right? And
Yeah.
once we've sort of like assigned judgment to something, we stop being curious about what's going on and we sort of pin that person there
Yeah.
in that
Freeze
place.
them in that frame
Yes.
where, okay, this is, and it's because it's something maybe that triggers us, that
Yes.
throws us off balance.
Yeah.
And so kind of piecing that apart and saying, hey, there's more going on. This student is more than this behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And the intention, like assuming good intention, is to say, if something is going on with that student or they wouldn't be acting like that, and how do I help?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That staying curious piece.
Yeah, I
Like
love that.
how can I help? Exactly. And sometimes that like staying curious piece applies to ourselves. So like when we think about prevention, intervention, and restoration, and we talk about that intervention piece, the very first step in intervention is that is self-reflection,
Yeah.
right? Just sort of paying attention to what's happening with ourselves, with our own minds and our own bodies. And so, like you mentioned a few minutes ago, it's our brain's nature to sort of unconsciously fill in unknown information when we're trying to understand a situation, a problem, or a person. And since the information is unknown, many times our brain uses like associated stereotypes to fill in the blanks, to fill in the information. But recognizing when that's happening or raising our awareness around it can really help us to stay grounded, avoid those faulty assumptions, and ultimately make decisions that are consistent with our conscious values and
Mm-hmm.
beliefs, Because sometimes our conscious values and beliefs are quite different than our unconscious,
Yes,
like
reactions.
stereotypes. Yes,
Like when
exactly.
you have a reaction, you go, "What was I thinking? I really didn't wish I hadn't said that or behaved
Yeah,
in that way." Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And that's our unconscious mind at work.
Yes.
But that level of self-awareness and self-reflection, it takes a lot of practice and it does take a lot of ongoing reflection. So it requires us to stay
Mm-hmm.
curious about ourselves and about the people around us. So it's important to always be thinking about and identifying our own buttons, as you mentioned, and
Mm-hmm.
our own unmet needs, so that we can understand when those things are being triggered or when our buttons are being pushed or when those unmet needs are really kind of flaring
Yeah.
out. Is it respect? Is it control? Is it fairness? Whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
really identifying that. Because as the great Dr. Dan Siegel says, when we name it, we can tame it,
Mm-hmm. It sounds easy, right?
It sounds so simple.
It's not easy.
I mean, we haven't even figured it out.
No, it's not easy.
It's not easy.
A work in progress. So, intervention, this idea that you could talk privately with the student, especially if a behavior seems socially focused, like I'm getting attention and I'm going to undermine authority. Like that's a private conversation you want to have.
Right.
So what does this conversation actually look like? You can normalize that feeling. When our behavior doesn't match our values, it feels uncomfortable. I think we all know that feeling.
Yeah.
And so you can say that to the child, to say, even with all this going on, the student is a good and respectful person and that they know what's right. And you believe in their ability to grow so that their behavior ends up matching more and more what they know is right. Sometimes, just as a side note, sometimes social anxiety can fuel that disruptive comedy routine.
Mm-hmm.
So the student actually might have some anxiety that they're coping with. And if they recently moved to the area because they're fairly new in your classroom, they may be clearly using some unhealthy means to get needed attention and connection.
Mhm.
So you can feel that out during the conversation, see what comes up with the student. And if the student isn't already connected to student services, you might want to offer them that option, and you can facilitate that too. Creating a plan then with the student to make things better. So with nonverbals or other things that other students won't see or notice, can help avoid some of that social embarrassment of actively working on something. If the student has a history of this and has gotten attention over time, this can also kind of morph into the comedy routine featuring this dramatic power play,
Mhm.
right? This sounds like fun, right? As a student tries to at least look like they have control over the situation, when in reality it's really hard for them to actually steer their own actions. So it's a way to save face. Basically, oppositional behavior can also be a part of ADHD. And so it affects emotional regulation. So the challenging part is to not take this overt disrespect, even though it's overt
Mhm.
and it's in front of your whole class,
Yeah.
to not take that personally.
Yeah.
A little bit challenging,
Oh,
right?
it's super,
Yeah.
super challenging, especially if respect is a button for us,
Yeah,
and it is for a
definitely.
lot of
Yeah.
us. And in this situation, I think because this is kind of, in my mind anyway, this is sort of a common childhood behavior, right?
Yeah.
That we see a lot pop up. And for a lot of our seasoned educators, we've seen it so many times, and a lot of times it is maybe commonly attached to something. So maybe it's commonly attached to ADHD. Maybe it's
Yeah.
commonly attached to, what you might say is like a child who's been overly indulged at home, or something like that. And so they have too much power and they assert their power in other places.
Yeah.
And so it's easy then for our unconscious mind, right, to fill in the
Yes.
answer to this question
Yeah.
about this kid. Oh, I've seen this one too many times. I know exactly what the problem is, and I'm going to solve it this way,
Yeah, and sometimes, it's things that children have been through, and having a trauma experience, a trauma background, can look like all those things when really it's trauma, fueled by trauma.
Yeah, which is why it's so important to don't let your unconscious mind take over,
Yes, yes.
and to just really try hard to avoid judging this situation based on your experiences with
Yes.
other situations, so that's I think the most challenging part is when we have so much experience and we have so many times we've seen the same thing over and over again, to not just create a category for that behavior.
Yes, this student reminds me of these three other students.
Correct.
And this is what was going on with them.
Yes.
So I'm putting this student in the same
category.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it might be something really different.
Correct.
Yeah.
So staying curious, keeping that problem solving mindset, keeping that sort of growth view of things and expanding our view, super challenging because
Yes.
we have so much experience over here, but super important. It's actually what we kind of ask of parents who have had negative after negative after negative experience with the education
Yes,
system, from
true.
all the way back to their own
True.
childhood a lot of times. And we just ask them to give us a clean slate, give us the benefit of the doubt. I'm not that same person that you
Yeah.
experienced before. We need that from them in order to have healthy engagement and relationships. And so we have to do the same for our students too, and say, okay, I'm going to erase,
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold you to the same standard or put you in the same box that I put all these other people in.
But it is really challenging to do this through connection.
Yeah.
It's quicker and sometimes immediately seems to be effective to use more authority
Yeah.
and intimidation.
Yeah.
So I raise my voice and the child is silent,
Yeah.
but it doesn't stick.
Well, that actually leads well into our next slide about restoration and about like what you always talk about, that emotional bank account. I think
there is an emotional bank account that we can kind of like, if we think about it in those terms, it helps us understand all kinds of different relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that, teachers, first of all, are human and they can get thrown off balance. And it's really important to acknowledge our own dysregulation and take a couple of minutes to regain our balance. And then students, of course, we know this from experience and from research, they do best and take responsibility for things better when they feel actually legitimately cared about. So putting our energies into restoration and investing in that connection is something. It's like an investment. I'm investing. You can like have that as a little mantra in your head, like I'm investing, because it's not always easy, and there isn't time carved out for this.
No.
So you have to put up energy up front to create this. We are so rushed for time sometimes, and it takes energy and to get through the content that we're already worrying about. So we often rush this process of restoration, and it really can't happen until both people are regulated. You can't have one, you or the student, in a kind of off balance way and actually have a restoration. So it may come in stages, multiple conversations over a few days to get to that place where you feel like, oh, I've put some deposits in this bank account and now we're not in the red.
Right.
Like there's no deficit going on here. So I'm wondering if you listening to this, if you have tricks that you've used to reconnect with a student after there's been a withdrawal, after you feel like there has been something where you have to do an intervention, go ahead and please put that into our Padlet after this episode. We would love to hear your ideas and share them with others.
Yeah, that would be great if we had like a sort of a bank of strategies.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
So we are wondering about you, how your balancing act is going with all the important elements in your life. And here's some reminders on this particular slide to think about rebalancing and taking care of yourself. Remember that healthy mind platter from our early release day in January. And you can look that up if you're interested in a refresher with Dr. Siegel. And you can also check out the self-care wheel that's available on our launch page for episode 3 of this series.
All right, so we introduced this graphic in our first session, and then we've used it to kind of wrap up our second and third sessions, and that's kind of what we're going to continue to do, is sort of revisit this graphic. We used a plant to demonstrate sort of the intricate and interdependent relationships between the district priorities that support our goal of creating compassionate schools. So as we're now kind of wrapping up our fourth session, we just want to kind of do a quick check-in to see how the knowledge, understanding, and application of the trauma-informed practices that we've been talking about are integral to nourishment of our school communities. So is that starting to kind of make sense and come together? Are we starting to see how our growth, as a school community, is dependent on our ability to make connections, to foster healthy relationships, and to thrive together? Because it's how we activate our trauma-sensitive mindset, that curiosity, and apply our knowledge that will truly evolve our relationships with our students and colleagues. And that's what's really going to lead to the transformation of our school communities to becoming compassionate.
Yeah.
So remember to access the other training materials for this session, and then post a comment or a question to the discussion board or to the Padlet in order to earn the in-service point that we have available for each session. For the remainder of the school year, we're going to continue to add a new training session each month that will build on all of the concepts we talked about. So please continue to revisit the course and to discover our new content. And use the link to our Padlet to let us know if there's specific scenarios or examples that you would like us to highlight or review. So we'd love to hear from you. Even if we don't end up using it for this year, we're going to continue to expand upon these trainings next year. So we're always looking for ways that we can actually practically help to problem solve with you guys or demonstrate.
And it's fun, Wendy, to hear back from people that we're not just talking to each other.
Yeah, even though that's exactly what it feels like. Yeah. So thank you so much for participating in session 4. We hope that you found some useful tidbits from this, and we hope to see you or hear from you again.
Yes, thanks for spending time with us. Take care and stay safe.
Stay safe.